Right now, the world has more active military flashpoints than at any point since 1945. The Middle East is on fire. NATO is stretched across two fronts, and the Pacific is one miscalculation away from a superpower collision.
But there's one continent that sits almost completely outside the blast radius, not because of its military, not because of its politics, because of its geography. This is why Australia might be the hardest country on Earth to touch in a global war, and why that's starting to change.
Start with the most obvious advantage: water. Australia is surrounded by it, on every side.
The nearest major military power, China, is over 7,500 kilometers away. Russia, over 10,000. To put that in perspective, D-Day, the largest naval invasion in human history, crossed just 160 kilometers of English Channel, and it nearly failed. Projecting military force across an ocean isn't just expensive, it's logistically punishing. Every soldier needs food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and all of it has to cross thousands of kilometers of open water, exposed to submarines, missiles, and airstrikes the entire way. But the distance problem is even worse than it sounds. Let's actually do the math. A single aircraft carrier strike group burns roughly 22,000 gallons of fuel per hour. To project meaningful force across 7,500 kilometers, you'd need a constant chain of resupply vessels stretching from your home port to the combat zone. Every single one of those tankers is a target. And unlike the Atlantic or Mediterranean, the route to Australia doesn't have convenient allied ports along the way. There's no island-hopping chain, no friendly harbor to refuel in. Just open Indo-Pacific water, patrolled by Australian, American, and Allied submarines. During World War II, the United States built the most powerful navy in human history, and it still took them 3 years of brutal island hopping to push across the Pacific, and they were going the other direction, toward Asia, not away from it. Now imagine doing that in reverse against a continent that's watching you come from 7,500 kilometers away. There's no surprise attack, no blitzkrieg. Satellites and over-the-horizon radar would spot a fleet weeks before it arrived. You'd be fighting a battle the defender has been preparing for since the moment you left port. And here's the part that gets overlooked. Fuel isn't the only problem, time is. No nation in history has ever sustained an invasion force across this kind of distance. Japan tried in 1942. They got as far as bombing Darwin and launching midget submarines into Sydney Harbor. They never came close to landing troops. The ocean doesn't just slow an invasion, it starves one. In May 1942, Japan launched an operation to capture Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, essentially Australia's front door. If they'd taken it, they would have had bomber range over every major city on the East Coast. What stopped them wasn't the Australian Army. It was the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never even saw each other. Everything was fought by carrier aircraft. Japan lost the strategic initiative, the invasion force turned back, and Australia survived, not because it was strong enough to fight, but because the ocean between them was simply too contested to cross safely. That battle is the single best example of why water doesn't just separate countries, it decides wars, and Australia has more of it than almost anyone else. But let's say you somehow cross the ocean. You now face the second problem. Where do you land? Australia has over 36,000 kilometers of coastline. That's longer than the entire circumference of Africa. But here's the paradox: 98% of it is completely empty. The North Coast? Tropical mangroves, crocodile-infested wetlands, and monsoon flooding half the year. The West? Desert cliffs that drop straight into the Indian Ocean. The South? Some of the most violent open oceans on Earth. The Southern Ocean, where 12-meter swells are routine. The only strategically valuable coastline, the East, where 90% of Australians actually live, is shielded by the Great Dividing Range, a 3,500-kilometer mountain spine that runs the entire length of the continent. You can't land where people live, and where you can land, there's nothing there. Even if you establish a beachhead on the northern coast, which Japan planned but never attempted, you now have to cross this. The Australian Outback. 70% of the continent is arid or semi-arid desert, temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius, almost zero fresh water, and virtually no infrastructure connecting the north to the populated south. Darwin to Sydney is over 3,100 kilometers of nothing. No rail network connecting them, no major highways through the interior. Your supply lines would stretch across terrain that kills unprepared civilians, let alone an invasion force carrying heavy equipment. For comparison, the Soviet Union used this exact strategy against Napoleon and Hitler. Let the land destroy the invader. Australia doesn't even have to try. The continent does it automatically. There's another geographic advantage that almost nobody talks about, and it's not even Australian territory. Indonesia. Over 17,000 islands stretching across the entire northern approach to Australia. Any naval force heading south has to navigate through narrow straits and choke points. The Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Timor Sea, each one a potential ambush point. Indonesia isn't a formal military ally, but it functions as a geographic buffer zone. Even in a neutral scenario, any invasion fleet has to pass through Indonesian waters, and that adds complexity, time, and risk to an already impossible logistics chain. It's like trying to break into a house where the neighbor's yard is a minefield. You haven't even reached the front door, and you're already in trouble. But geography isn't just about defense, it's about survival. And Australia is one of the most self-sufficient nations on Earth. It's the world's largest exporter of iron ore and one of the top producers of uranium, coal, natural gas, and gold. It produces enough food to feed 80 million people, more than 3 times its own population. And beneath the Outback sits the Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest underground freshwater reserves on the planet. In a global war, when supply chains collapse and imports vanish, Australia can feed itself, fuel itself, and sustain itself. Most countries cannot say that. And then there's the alliance factor. Australia isn't alone. It's a founding member of Five Eyes, the most powerful intelligence alliance on Earth. It hosts Pine Gap, one of the most important satellite surveillance facilities outside the United States. And under AUKUS, it's acquiring nuclear-powered submarines designed to project power across the Pacific. Attacking Australia doesn't just mean fighting Australia, it means fighting the United States and the United Kingdom by treaty. But here's what most geography channels won't tell you. The shield is cracking. Modern warfare doesn't require boots on the ground. Hypersonic missiles can cross 7,500 kilometers in under 30 minutes. Cyber attacks can disable power grids and port systems from the other side of the planet. And long-range precision strikes mean you don't need to invade a country to cripple it. Australia's own Defence Strategic Review acknowledged this directly. The sea-air gap that protected Australia for 200 years is collapsing. Distance still matters, but it matters less every year. But the most terrifying scenario isn't missiles. It's what happens before the missiles. In 2024, Australia identified over 94,000 cybersecurity incidents targeting critical infrastructure, power plants, water treatment facilities, port logistics systems. These weren't random hackers. These were state-level operations, testing for weaknesses. A coordinated cyber attack could shut down the Port of Melbourne, which handles 37% of Australia's container trade, without a single weapon being fired. Disable the communications grid, and those 7,500 kilometers of protective ocean become irrelevant because Australia can't coordinate its own defense. Geography protects you from occupation. It doesn't protect you from disruption. And in modern warfare, disruption might be enough to win.
Australia's defense planners know this. It's why the AUKUS submarine deal isn't just about submarines. It's about signaling to any potential adversary that the cost of even testing Australia's defenses is unacceptably high. So here's the critical distinction. You can strike Australia, you can hurt Australia, but can you conquer it?
That's where geography still wins, because occupation requires what technology cannot replace: supply lines, manpower, and time. And the Australian continent devours all three. Australia's safety in a global war was never about its military strength. It was about 7.7 million square kilometers of ocean, desert, and emptiness that make invasion not just difficult, but functionally impossible. The question isn't whether Australia is safe. The question is, for how long? Drop a country in the comments and we'll break down its geography next.